you guys all for coming. We're very excited to have such a large turnout on our first lecture. I hope you guys all come to our subsequent lectures as well. It is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Chris Lowe. I know him from when I did my master's degree at Long Beach State, and he asked me a confusing question during my thesis defense and threw me all off. So despite that, I have forgiven him and invited him here to speak today. He is definitely a biology expert, very fluent in sharks. He received his master's degree from Long Beach State as well. Afterwards, he went on to get his PhD at the University of Hawaii. He's spent 17 years now running the Shark Lab at California State University, Long Beach. That Shark Lab was actually started back in 1969, so it's been there for a while. He's been running it for 17 years now, and during that time, he has helped mentor over 30 graduate students doing research on everything from sharks to fish and everything in between. So it is my honor to introduce Dr. Chris Lowe.
Thank you. It's an impressive crowd draw. So, how many people have lived here in Southern California for 10 years? 20 years? 30 years? 40? 50? Okay. 60. Oh, hey. 70. Okay. Okay, my point of my talk tonight is that the ocean is changing. And it's changing sometimes so slowly that we don't even know what's happening. So what I've been getting for the last 8 to 10 years is what is going on with sharks in Southern California. And I get it every single summer. And I too have been thinking, what is going on with sharks in Southern California? So for the last 17 years, I've been running the Shark Lab. Shark Lab started in 1969 by a guy named Don Nelson, who I got to do my master's degree with. He was a world's expert on shark behavior. And he used a lot of technology tools, developed a lot of technology tools that we use today worldwide to not only study fish, but to study sharks, rays, turtles, everything you can imagine. So I'm really fortunate to come from a lab that has history in this. But the point of my talk tonight is this, and even I was confronted with this. This is what we hear day in, day out. From the news, from the media, we hear bad news all the time about the environment, and in many cases for good reasons. Now this trend started at least 50 years ago. We've had 50 years of bad news, mainly because we've had a growing problem on the planet. And when I mean growing problem, I'm talking about the number of people on the planet. So we had a little dip back during the Black Death, during the plague, but after that, it's been kind of shooting up. That same trend holds true for California. So you got to remember, back in California in the 1900s, we were talking literally maybe 30, 50,000 people in California. There weren't that many people here, but look at this rate of population growth. We're at 38 million people in the state of California, 25 million of which live within 60 miles of the coastline. So you have this huge coastal population that has impacts on the coastal ocean. And we've had literally over 100 years of that. So, many of you are going, this must be shark talk, but trust me, sharks will come. Sharks will come. So we have the hazy days of California. And for those of you that raised your hands about living in California for 30, 40, 50 years, this was a very common sight. I mean, we didn't know there were coastal mountains. When I first moved here, you couldn't see them. Maybe 2 days out of the year. And it got so bad that literally there were air advisories every day. So the point was, in the 40s, it was actually our worst air quality. It was in the 1940s. Citizens were concerned. They were actually worried about air quality back in the 1940s. And in fact, it was the 70s. It was Southern California that drove a lot of legislation that was instrumental in passing the Clean Air Act. Now, what does that have to do with the ocean? What goes into our atmosphere ultimately goes into the ocean. And it affects oceanic processes, and it affects everything that lives in the ocean. Now, the thing I would like to point out is that we have 3 to 5 times more people living in California now than we did during our nadir, when things were the worst. But we have better air quality now than we did 30 or 40 years ago. We've improved things with more people, more cars. We did that by passing important legislation that regulated what we could and could not do to our environment. What about the ocean? Same thing. We were dumping things straight into the ocean. We were discharging raw sewage, and with that, industrial waste, things like that, were not uncommon up into the 70s, and we had beach closures routinely. So, once again, California was discharging raw sewage, and at the time, we're talking maybe 10 million people living in coastal California, all going to the bathroom every day, flushing the lever. Where did it all go? Right offshore. So at the time, it was just screening out the big chunks, right? We had our worst water quality back in the 70s. In addition, because of LA, we had a lot of industry. We were discharging a lot of industrial contaminants that also went out. And for those of you that have lived in this particular neck of the woods, the bay needed healing back then. And it's done a lot of healing since then. So again, Southern California was instrumental in driving some of the national legislation that was put forth for the Clean Water Act. So in 1972, we had to clean up our act. Since then, we now have full secondary treatment throughout all California. So we actually have some of the best wastewater treatment that exists anywhere in the world, considering that we have 25 million people that are all discharging offshore on a daily basis. So remember, 40 years ago, 3 times fewer people. And we have more people, and we have cleaner, better water quality now than we did back then. Things have been getting better in these things. In addition, we've had a community that lives by the coast and loves seafood. We've had a seafood-loving community, and there's nothing wrong with that. These natural resources here, they were readily abundant, and we've had 100 years of whacking them down, overfishing. And it wasn't just fish, it's many other animals, like marine mammals as well. Many marine mammals were hunted to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s. And we had a lot of dirty fisheries that literally took until the mid-90s to clean those things up. So as a result, we lost most of our predators from our ocean. And when I mean predators, this is when we start talking about sharks, right? So white sharks being at the top. But marine mammals are important predators in the ocean. A lot of the game fish that we like to eat are important predators. We have driven all those down. So for 40 or 50 years, we have had 2 generations of Americans that have been going into an ocean that has been largely predator depopulated. Okay? We recognized this problem, and we started passing legislation back in the 70s. Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1973 because most marine mammals in U.S. waters were hunted to the verge of extinction. State passes an nearshore gillnet ban because they recognize not just depletion of target species, but high marine mammal bycatch. Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is the federal act that regulates fisheries management throughout U.S. waters, was first started in 1976, modified again in 1996, with an emphasis on reducing bycatch in fisheries. And then, of course, in California, we passed our own Marine Life Management Act in 1999. So we recognize these serial depletions in our ocean, and we've been doing things about it. So, over this time period of poor air quality, poor water quality, overfishing, we have systematically removed all these predators. They felt the brunt of it. Not only have we directly removed them, but we've done things to lower parts of the trophic food web because of water quality problems that the remaining predators really had nothing to eat. In addition, we were taking out the same things those predators need to eat, and as a result, many of those populations declined. So this has cascading effects on our food web, and we've experienced an altered food web in our ocean for over 100 years. Now, typically, this is what you'd see in natural situations. You have lots of primary consumers, and then things that eat the worms, and then fish that eat the fish that eat the worms, and so on, right? Sea lions, and of course, at the very top of the white sharks that are eating the sea lions and things down the chain. So direct fishing removes some of these right off the bat. Now, direct fishing alone is not enough to fully put a food web out of whack. In addition, water quality, overfishing of other species can then cause many of these species to either starve or simply leave because there isn't sufficient resources for them to survive. And as a result, you end up with a predator-to-populate environment. So what really got me thinking about this this was 2 years ago. We've been doing white shark research in Southern California for about 9 or 10 years now. And 2 years ago, some conservation groups put forth petitions to the state and federal government to list white sharks as threatened and endangered. And when that happened, normally I would have been saying, yes, save the sharks. But at the time, we were seeing something that didn't match what they were claiming. So some of the studies claim that there are only 350 sharks in California, in Central California. And we've just published a study that indicated that study was a little flawed. It's probably more like 2,400 sharks. In addition, they argued that sharks are being killed in commercial fisheries, and there's some truth to that. They were being harmed by pollution. In fact, most of the data that they used from these studies came from our research. And they argued that the population was dangerously low and deserved protection. So this didn't match what we were seeing, particularly here in Southern California. So to give you a little background on what we know about white sharks in the Pacific. So first of all, white sharks, we call them the apex predator of the ocean. They are not. We are the apex predator of the ocean. They even succumb to us. They are vulnerable to overfishing because of their life history. They take 12 years to reach sexual maturity. They can live to be 70 years old. They produce litter sizes of maybe 2 to 14 pups every 2, possibly 3 years. So they are not very cunning. They can't reproduce very quickly. So as a result, it doesn't take long to fish them down. With that said, there's never been a directed fishery for white sharks anywhere in the world because their numbers typically are low. In addition, they are still valuable. So if a fisherman did catch them or does catch them, their fins are worth a lot of money, their jaws are worth a lot of money, their meat is perfectly edible and valuable. So as a result, there is value to them. They have been occasionally caught as bycatch in many fisheries worldwide. And when they have been caught, obviously these things have been sold. So there's high market value for them. Now the thing that still amazes me to this day, white sharks have a reputation for occasionally negatively interacting with people. So despite that reputation, the state of California had the wherewithal in 1994 to pass protection to protect white sharks because we recognized how vulnerable they could be to overfishing. In 1997, white sharks were protected throughout the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. In 2004, they were protected throughout the world by CITES, so their parts could not be traded among nations. And in 2005, they were protected throughout the rest of the U.S. EEZ, which means white shark populations in California throughout U.S. waters have effectively been protected from fishing pressure for 15 to 20 years now. So, 20 years ago, if you had asked a shark biologist what kind of shark we thought a white shark was, we would have said, white sharks are coastal sharks. And if you'd asked, well, how do you know that? We would say, well, in the fall, around the Farallon Islands and the Central California coast, we see white sharks right off the beaches, and they're feeding on seeds. And then if you said, well, where do they go after that? We'd say, well, we don't know. So what happened about 15 years ago, new technology gave us tools that enabled us to figure something out that proved us completely wrong. So we know that there are some aggregation sites up around the Farallon Islands and in Nuevo where these adult white sharks aggregate in the fall months to take advantage of elephant seals that call out and give birth to their pups. So it becomes a centralized feeding. There's another location that was recently discovered down in Guadalupe Island, Mexico. Now, using technology called satellite tags that we can place on these sharks, my colleagues have found that sharks tagged around these places that spend a few months up around these aggregation sites will migrate out to the middle of the Pacific or the Hawaiian Islands, spend 8 months to a year and a half out there before they'll return to one of these aggregation sites, either Guadalupe Island or the Farallones. So for the sharks that they managed to tag at these locations, a vast majority of these sharks have gone out to the middle of the ocean. We have no idea what they're doing. We just know that they're spending 8 months to a year and a half, which means, at least for these sharks, they're not coastal sharks at all. These are oceanic sharks that occasionally come in close to shore. Now, why else would they come into shore? Well, they come into shore to give birth. So one of the other things we know is that the Southern California bight, that's from Santa Barbara to the Mexican border, down to northern Baja, is a nursery ground for white sharks in the Northeast Pacific. So we know that because, based on historic fishing records, baby white sharks, and when I mean a baby white shark, that's a 5-foot-long shark, can be caught over coastal piers, and not beach pier, in the summer months. So based on this, shark biologists theorized that this is a nursery and pupping ground for white sharks. Now, we don't know where that actually occurs. We just know that these babies miraculously show up on their beaches. So what we wanted to do is test some of these ideas about what these claims were being made about impacts to white sharks. Are there really impacts from commercial fishing? Who are the ones being having impacts, and how has that changed over time? So to do that, my students and I combed through fishing records going back almost 100 years. And we found a variety of records, even looking at fishing logs, scientific collections. Monterey Bay Aquarium has been involved in a research program now for almost 10 years. And from that, we found 369 records of white sharks being caught or reported caught in fisheries, different types of fisheries, commercial or recreational fisheries. And in some of those records, there was information about how big some of these sharks were. Not surprisingly, the most common size shark caught in any fishery were what we call babies. We call them young of the year, so they're less than 1 year old. So a baby white shark is less than 6 feet long. A juvenile white shark is between 6 and about 12 feet long, and then anything over 12 feet long we consider a subadult to an adult. So as you can see, most of the sharks being caught in any fishery are these babies. And that makes sense because most fishing gear can't really hold these bigger sharks. Now in some cases we had evidence of what fishery was interacting, and when we saw this information, this was actually really enlightening. Because it turns out that over 85% of the records of all the different fisheries we found, entanglements were the ones where white sharks were found the most. And most of the times, these were these young of the year, these baby white sharks. Most of the other commercial fisheries had very minimal interactions, but not surprisingly, recreational fishing is the second highest reported occurrence. Most of these, believe it or not, are caught along our coastline, particularly off our ocean piers. So when we look at the locations of where different sizes were caught from these fishing records, this is for all sharks by size class. These blocks that you see are called Department of Fish and Game fishing blocks. So when a commercial fisherman has to report where they fish, they don't have to give it their secret spot. They just have to say what block they were fishing in. So these blocks are 10 miles by 10 miles. Now the darker colors indicate where more sharks were caught. So as you can see, most adult white sharks found in records from 1936 to 2009 were primarily found off Anacapa, Catalina, and off Palos Verdes, but very few records. When we look at juveniles, we see a different pattern. We see more juveniles are caught in some of our coastal blocks. You'll see this gray line right here, this one right here, that's the state demarcation point. So anything inside 3 nautical miles is state waters. Anything outside that is federal waters. So we find the young of the year, however, are being caught most commonly, particularly in these coastal blocks. But it's really a hotspot off Ventura. There's a hotspot in Santa Monica. There's another hotspot off Huntington Beach, Dana Point, and San Diego. So based on fishing records alone, we're able to get an idea of where different size classes of white sharks have been over about a 100-year run. Now, remember I told you the #1 fishery that had the greatest interaction with white sharks was gillnet. So remember in 1994, because of declining catch of target species, which included white sea bass and California halibut, plus high bycatch of birds and marine mammals, the state of California voted to ban the use of gillnets in state waters, which means gillnetters would literally set from the beach out offshore. After 1994, it was illegal to set a gillnet inside state waters. It's still illegal to set them outside of state waters, but there aren't very many places where these gillnetters can still find shallow enough water offshore where they can still set gillnets. So these lines that you see right here indicate the number of gillnets set in 2 different fisheries: an offshore drift gillnet fishery, which is targeting swordfish and sharks, and a nearshore drift set in drift gillnet fishery targeting halibut, angel sharks, and white sea bass. So the interesting thing is when we look at the records, 1985 was the peak of this fishery. And in 1985, there were over 1,200 gillnet permits in the state of California. There were 1,200 boats fishing gillnets. That fishery exploded in California. So we see a rapid increase in effort. We see the reported catch of white sharks go up. And then the fishery starts to decline, in some cases because it's being regulated. In other cases, they're seeing depletion of target species, and therefore they're not catching as much. In 1994, the state of California passes the nearshore gillnet ban, so it's illegal to set gillnets in nearshore waters. Most of the gillnetters went out of business. And in addition, in 1994, we passed legislation to protect white sharks in California. Now, prior to 1994, if a gill netter caught a white shark in their nets, they would land it. They caught it, they cut it up, took it to a fish market, they sold it in fish markets, and they sold it as shark. So if you ate shark, what you thought was mako or thresher, between 1980 and 1994, there's a good chance you ate white shark and you didn't even know. So prior to 1994, white sharks were harvested in California. After 1994, if a fisherman caught a white shark in their nets, they were legally required to shake them out, to let them go. So what we've seen since 1994 is that gill net fishing has been pretty stable. Now, of the offshore gill net fleet, there's only 12 boats left. Of the inshore gill net fleet, there are 40 permits, or 140 permits, but only about 40 boats active. So that fishery is pretty much gone extinct. And remember, they can no longer fish inside state waters. But this is the part that I want to point out to you. So with an 82% reduction in gill net, we've seen more and more of these baby white sharks being reported caught in the remaining gill net fishery. So by working with commercial fishermen, they would tell us when they caught sharks, and then we could go down and assess their sharks. But what we've seen since about 2002 is a steady increase in the number of sharks. So we believe that this is probably our best evidence for an increase in the population. So it's likely that gill netting had a negative impact on white sharks, but it can't be fishing alone that had that impact. But nevertheless, banning gill net is probably one of the key reasons why this population is showing signs of recovery. Now, it's not just white sharks that are showing this trend. So, for example, one of the major target species of that gill net fishery was white sea bass. So anybody who was a fisherman back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, white sea bass was like a unicorn. It was this mythical beast that people had heard about but never caught before. So what we've seen since 1994, since the gill net ban, white sea bass catch in the remaining commercial fishery is going up. Recreational fishers know that you're catching white sea bass again. So banning gill nets in your shore waters has seemed to have important impacts on recovery of target species. We've seen this in other populations as well. These are data from Dan Pondella and Larry Allen, who used a combination of fishing and diver observations. And this axis indicates the number of individuals either seen per dive or caught in a net for black sea bass. They're trending up since 1994. Soupfin shark have been trending up since 1994. Leopard sharks have been steadily trending up since 1994. All these populations have been steadily increasing since primarily the banning of nearshore gill nets. But that in and of itself is probably not enough to allow these populations to recover. Probably one of the best examples, and remember, all these species I'm talking about, we call them mesopredators, middle intermediate predators. Juvenile white sharks can feed on, or adult white sharks can feed on. So here's a primary food for an adult white shark, and I'm going to use California sea lion because I think it's one of the most stark examples. So in 1920, beach counts indicated that there were as few as 2,000 California sea lions in all of California and Baja. By 1920, they had been hunted to the verge of extinction. Marine mammal biologists thought Pacific harbor seals, northern elephant seal, California sea lions were done. So we can see the population is barely trending. In 1973, the Marine Mammal Protection Act goes into place. If a fisherman saw a California sea lion going out of the harbor, they would simply shoot them. They viewed them as competitors, and it was not illegal. 1973, it is now illegal. Look what the population starts to do. It starts jumping up. What about this little notch here? Anybody know what happened in the mid-80s? Actually, we had a strong El Nino, and that El Nino was brutal on our marine mammal populations because that period lasted for quite a while. We see a stabilization of the population. Anybody remember what happened in the mid-90s? Well, we banned nearshore gill nets, which was killing a lot of marine mammals, and we heavily regulated the offshore gill net fleet, which was also killing marine mammals. And since then, the population has been growing at a rate marine mammal biologists thought was impossible. They were growing at a rate of 6.5% a year. Other marine mammal populations, cetacean populations, have been growing at a rate of 10% a year. We thought it was impossible. What do these things eat? They eat the same things we do. So remember in the 90s, we're being told the ocean's overfished, there's nothing left. How are these populations growing at that rate if there's nothing left? They're feed on the same things we do. And in 2012, NOAA determined that the population to reach carrying capacity had over 470,000 California sea lions. It's not just their populations that have shown this trend. It's been pretty much all of our marine mammals. But you've got to look at this over a century of time. So the question you all want to know is, what's the deal with these babies in Santa Monica Bay? So for the last 8 or 10 years, we've been working with Monterey Bay Aquarium to try to figure out what we can learn about the ecology of white sharks that doesn't come from fishing methods. So one of the questions we want to know is, where are they born? So we know we see them along our beaches. We know they're fairly small and probably close to newborns, but we don't know where birthings occur. Where do they go? This is another question we've been trying to answer. What do they eat when they're here? Is that why they're here? Are they here to feed on certain things? And how long do they stay? So these are questions that we've been trying to answer. And of course, whose babies are they? Remember I told you there's a population in the Farallones, there's another population in Guadalupe Island, and by looking at their genetics, we can tell who's your mama, who's your dad, and try to figure out where these babies, moms and dads are from. So for the last 9 years, we've been working with commercial fishermen who are incidentally catching these white sharks. And when a fisherman caught a white shark, they would call us up. My team, this is Chuck Winkler, he's also a member of the team. My students would go down and meet the fisherman at the dock. Here is a fishing tote with a baby white shark in it. These are legal-sized California halibut. The fisherman would take the shark out of the net, put it in his tote, call us up, say, meet us at the dock, drive down the dock. We would meet the fisherman there. We could assess the shark. We could take measurements, tissue samples, a blood sample, and then tag them with a variety of tags that we could use to follow them around. Then the fisherman would drive us offshore. We could release the shark. And number one, see if they survive. And number two, see where they go. So in addition, the aquarium has also done some directed fishing. So we actually hired a spotter plane and a purse seiner to help us spot little white sharks in Santa Monica Bay, and then we would set a purse seine around it. So here's an aerial photograph. Here's a baby white shark. The net set around it. We can slowly purse the net up. And then once we get the net pursed up, we can literally work that little shark right into this sling, bring the shark onto the boat. Normally, they just lay there. This one's saying, I'm ready to go back in the water. We put all our tags on it, let it go. The whole process takes literally 15 to 20 minutes, and then the shark's back in the water. So in order to answer our questions, we're using new technology. And this is some of the technology that the Shark Lab has literally developed back in the 60s. So one of the types of technology we use, and many of you probably heard about if you watch Shark Week or if you watch the news about O-Search and things like that, are using satellite tags to track where these sharks go. So we use two types. One type are called pop-off archival satellite tags. These tags have a temperature sensor, a depth sensor, and a light sensor. We attach it with a little harpoon dart, and this thing floats off the shark. We let the shark go, but we can program this at a particular date to pop off the shark, float to the surface, and when it reaches the surface, it disgorges all its information to the satellite. I can be sitting in my office, and I'll get an email alert saying, shark number 105 is reported, and here's the date. So the great thing about this is the shark could be in Japan, and we can get that information back. The bad thing about it is it doesn't tell us exactly where the shark is when it's in the water. So the other type of tag we use is what's called a spot tag. And this tag actually gets bolted to the shark's dorsal fin, and it only transmits when the shark's dorsal fin breaks the surface. Satellite transmitters use a radio relay, and radio waves do not penetrate seawater very well. So the only way you can get that signal up to the satellite is the antenna has to break the surface. Every time the shark's fin breaks the surface, there's a saltwater switch, then it opens the circuit and allows it to transmit to the satellites, and then we can get information back into the desk, giving me a more precise latitude and longitude of where the shark popped out. So using these two pieces of technology, this one will tell us the depth that it's at, and this one will tell us its location. Now the problem with both these technologies is they only tell us where they are when the tags are at the surface. So we need something that tells us where, because sharks aren't marine mammals, they don't have to come to the surface to breathe, they don't have to come to the surface at all. So the other technology we use are called acoustic transmitters. Now acoustic transmitters put out an acoustic ultrasonic pulse at a frequency that the sharks cannot hear and we cannot hear, but we can put out listening stations along the coast that are out listening 24/7. Now each shark's transmitter has a unique ID code. So we surgically implant these into the body cavity, do a little surgery, stitch them up. The transmitters with the shark for life. The transmitters have battery lives up to 8 to 10 years. So the new ones we're putting out have 10-year battery lives. So when a shark swims by one of these acoustic receivers along your coast, if it's within 500 to 800 yards, it's like easy passing the freeway for sharks. It says shark number 305 just past this location at this date at this time. So by having an array of these receivers out along the coast, we can monitor these sharks while they're in the water. So using a combination of all these techniques, we can begin to figure out where these sharks are. So remember I told you that there's still commercial gill netting in California. It's legal, but it's all outside 3 miles. So remember, this line indicates federal waters. That's where it's legal to fish. This tan line that you see is state waters, and even though there's color in these blocks, there is no gill netting allowed inside state waters. Now, the redder the color indicates the greater amount of gill net fishing effort. From all the gill net fisheries, and this is for years 2006 to 2009. So working with commercial fishermen as our partners, when they caught sharks that they brought into us that we tagged and released, they gave us the location where they caught the sharks. So the symbols indicate locations where baby white sharks were caught by gill netters. And you can see a vast majority of them are caught in these coastal blocks, off Ventura, off Santa Monica Bay, off Huntington Flats, Dana Point, main locations where it looks like there's a lot of gill net fish, right? So if we looked at just location of where fishermen catch sharks relative to where all the fishing is occurring, you'd say, that's a lot of interaction. But what if we look at where these sharks go after they've been caught in gill net, tagged, and they're able to move around on their own? So if we use our spot tags to determine where they are when they're at the surface, this is what we see. So the white symbols indicate detections inside 3 miles, which is effectively a marine protected area for white sharks because gill netting is not allowed. So over 44% of our detections are in a habitat that's effectively protected from commercial fishing. And we do see that there are some detections in places where there is a lot of gill net fishing, but it's not only in those places. So it's not like gill netters and sharks are in the same place all the time. There is some interaction, there's no doubt. They're the ones catching us the sharks to tag. But we also know that many of the sharks that they caught, that they brought back, that were alive, that we tagged, are the ones giving us those data and survived. So we know they can be caught in gill net, shaken out of gill net, and survive. So with that said, not all sharks have been found in the nets alive. In fact, some of the sharks found by gill netters have been given to us as dead sharks. So what we notice is from year to year, the number of dead sharks reported to us varies. So in some years, it could be as high as 44% of all sharks reported. In other years, it could be lower. So we started to ask the fishermen a little bit more about how they fish. And what we found was, typically when fishermen had live sharks in their nets, they didn't have their nets out very long. They had them out less than 24 hours. However, if they let their nets out for too long, if they left their nets out for more than, say, 36 or 40 hours, there was a higher likelihood of having a dead shark. So what this means is we have information working with the fishermen to give them techniques where they can minimize bycatch. And we know, based on the ones that are alive that we've tagged, over 94% of those sharks survive. That is remarkable. Nobody else in the world has this kind of data on bycatch of any species. We're talking about millions of data, millions of dollars worth of data have been really funded largely by monitoring their code. And our partners have been the commercial fishermen. So remember I told you we get positions based on the spot tags. The problem is sometimes that positional accuracy isn't always that great. We know based on visual observations and from hearing from people like the general public that these little white sharks are literally right off our beaches. Those of you that have lived in this area, go out in the water a lot, have probably seen them yourselves. So we do know that they're beach babies. This is a picture taken by Randy White of a little white shark jumping off Little Rogers. So when we're out doing our targeted fishing sometimes, we're working with the aquarium, we have a spotter playing up. Little Rogers State Beach is literally right here. These are 2 stand-up paddle boarders. How many baby white sharks do you see?
4.
Okay, there's 5. That's Kelvin. That's just Kelvin. So in an area, maybe the size, a little bit bigger than a football field, we have 5 baby white sharks, literally just outside the break. This is, as many of you know, is not an uncommon phenomenon in Santa Monica Bay. What we have seen the last few years is kind of some shifts going on. We don't really understand. So about 5 or 6 years ago when we started, Many of the sharks that we were seeing were down off Will Rogers and Malibu Sock. And for the last 5 years, it's been Manhattan Beach, Porter. So there seems to be some shuffling around. We're not really sure why. We hope to try to answer those questions, but these are the patterns we're starting to see. So remember I told you we have our acoustic listening stations out along the coast. These are what we call bubble plots. So the bigger the bubble, the more detections per shark that we have. So our receivers off Will Rogers Beach gets a lot of detections. We tag the sharks literally right over here. This is Santa Monica Pier, right there. So we have a lot of detections of little white sharks swimming literally right by Santa Monica Pier. We have these little white sharks swim all throughout Palos Verdes. We had an individual do laps throughout LA Harbor. They would go in and out of LA Harbor, doing laps between Angels Gate and Queens Gate. And then typically in the winter, when our water temperatures start to drop, we've detected individuals migrating along the coast. So we've detected them on a receiver at Santa Monica Pier, or San Clemente Pier, Oceanside, all the way down to Tijuana. Our pop-off satellite tags tend to pop off down in Mexico. So we've known the last few years that most of the sharks that we tag in Southern California migrate south in the winter. So right now, working with the lifeguards, we're putting out more acoustic receivers throughout Santa Monica Bay so we can get a better idea where sharks are moving throughout the bay. These are the receivers that I was telling you about. So these are 2 receivers at Will Rogers Beach. This is Santa Monica Pier, and here's Manhattan Beach Pier. And this figure is the number of detections we get per hour. So quite often we use this as a way of determining what time of day might sharks be coming by certain locations. So one of the things you notice here is it's really during the day that the shark is in closest by these Will Rogers receivers, and the same trends for this one. So this is the one way down in the corner by the restaurants. This one's a little further down by the beach park. You see morning, they like going to the beach in the morning. Beach are there, right? When we hit the Santa Monica Pier, we see a little different behavior. So we see something that looks more like late afternoon, maybe a spike in evening. So we're seeing different patterns. As we increase the number of these receivers have out, our goal is to be able to tease out what these sharks are doing along our coast with better resolution. Unfortunately, we haven't had the Manhattan Beach Pier out very much. It seems like it's regularly just stopping by. Yeah. So at the time we had this receiver out, we now have more receivers, and we have hopefully get more sharks out. We'll get more data. We know there's more sharks coming by now. Our satellite tag data also give us an enhanced picture of what these little sharks are doing. So these are based on spot tag data. So this little shark was tagged over here at Malibu. And these detections indicate that this shark was spending most of its summer moving back and forth along our beaches, but occasionally making excursions out of the channel. We've even had some individuals go out by the Channel Islands, but turn around and come back to the beaches. By November, December, when our water temperatures start to drop, these little sharks aren't stupid, they might start migrating south and head to Baja. A vast majority of our pop-off satellite tags have popped off down about halfway down to Baja. We've had a few individuals that have gone all the way down into the Gulf, and we've had about 25% of the individuals that we've tagged or acoustic tags that we know have migrated to Baja turn around and come back to Southern California a subsequent summer. So we know that they make that migration, and they love Southern California so much they come. So the bottom line is we were making great progress until about 2 years ago. When the petitions went in to list white sharks as threatened and endangered, many of our permits were revoked or greatly restricted. So our research program has been basically stalled for the last 2 years. Hopefully now that both the state and federal government has voted not to list white sharks as threatened and endangered, mainly because the trend suggests the population is increasing, we're hoping we're going to get back to business. Now the great news is we have new tools to do our business. In fact, we have many of the tools needed to answer many of the questions that the public is asking about what these white sharks are doing. So one of our new tools that we're developing are autonomous robots. Great thing about robots is that, and I say my graduate students are over there, they're more reliable than my graduate students. I don't have to pay them anything. I just plug them in the wall for 12 hours, and they're fairly reliable. They show up where they're supposed to be. So, but the great thing about them is they can chew gum and swim at the same time. And that's really the cool thing about these things. So basically, they have a pair of ears that listens for the acoustic tag on the shark. We can program the robots to move up and down through the water column and measure water temperature, depth, chlorophyll, light levels, all those parameters, while it's stealthily following the shark. We programmed the robot to follow the shark, but not chase the shark. And it can accurately position the shark in 3D space and time. So by using fleets of these robots, we can have them cruise up and down along the coast and track the sharks for us. While they're doing that, they can be mapping the seafloor, they have video cameras, they have image sonar, we can record schools of fish, dolphins, all those sorts of things. So this new technology exists. We have it, we're raring to use it, we need more of it, we just need permission to get back out there to do that. In addition, we're also developing drone technology to do this. And I know this has been a bit of a debate and concern, but for scientific purposes, this can be a great tool. So our engineering department has the ability to make these little drones for us. The great thing about them is they can be fully automated and relatively cost effective. In any event, we've already used this tool to go to Catalina, and we use it for surveying for leopard sharks. Works great. So the nice thing about it is it can be fully automated. So you can literally touch a screen, put your fingers on the coordinates you want it to fly, set it in altitude, tell it what speed you want it to go. You have a little heads-up display so you can see what the camera sees, and you can literally fly transects along the beach. So this can become a non-intrusive way of surveying and looking along beaches and figuring out where the sharks, what are the conditions at this beach compared to this beach. So these are tools that we have fully developed. We're ready to use. So the bottom line, and many of you are probably the last few years been asking what's going on. Well, this is my opinion of what's going on. I think what we're seeing is the return of our predators. Our predators are coming back because we're restoring ecosystem function. We are bringing our ocean back to health. It's taken decades. It's been a very, very slow process. And this is why many of us haven't, I didn't recognize it when it was in front of me. But the bottom line is, it's more than just regulated fishing. That's not enough. We have to improve water quality. We've done that. That's allowed the forage fish to come back. Marine mammal populations that come back that feed on the forage fish, that's the only reason why they're recovering. White sharks feed on the marine mammals. That's why white sharks are coming back. Any of those links are missing, we don't get our top predators back. So the bottom line is, I would argue that our best example of a conservation success story is not the California climate, it's not the Bali climate, it's the white shark. Bringing this species back is something we spent a lot of time, effort, and money to do. It wasn't just protecting them, it was restoring ocean health. So this is the question we, as taxpayers, should be asking. We pass all this legislation. We pay taxes for it. We do it because we recognize a clean, healthy environment is good for our economy, it's good for us. But what we should be asking is it working? So I would argue that if we only had one or two of these things, we wouldn't see the success that we're seeing today. It's been a combination of all these things. We have sacrificed to put this in place. And trust me, I looked at the legislation when the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act was going in place. The opponent said, you cannot do this, you'll crush the U.S. economy. Here we are now. 5 times more people, cleaner water, cleaner air than we had 4 years ago. So the bottom line is, more and more people are going to the ocean, using the ocean for more reasons than ever before. Our shark populations, our marine mammal populations are increasing. We're seeing these animals more and more often. As the result, we have to learn to share the ocean with these animals again. And right now, what we're suffering from are some reality shock, right? So as these animals increase in number, we're going to have to learn to share the ocean with them, or we don't want these sorts of things to happen. We all still want to be able to do many of the things we do. But in order to do that and not go backwards, we're not going to start culling sharks out of the ocean and culling sea lions because they're endangered. We don't want to go backwards. We're going to have to learn to modify our behavior in ways that allow us to safely use the ocean and interact in ways that's clean. So the question I get all the time is, do we have to worry about these little sharks? Now, the one thing I'd like to point out is that for 4 or 5 years, these little sharks have been out there. Think about how many people surf on a daily basis. every day, right? Have you seen any sharks? Sure. Any problems with them?
Nope.
No. So this has been going on for 5 or 6 years, and the numbers keep going up and up. We haven't had any problems because these little sharks are minding their own business. So until that changes, and it could as the population grows, we don't know. We have a lot of questions we still need to answer. But right now, I don't think these little sharks pose a threat. When they do pose a threat is when we as water users begin to conflict in interests. We have to find ways to share the ocean. In my opinion, the best way to do that is education. My job as a scientist is to collect information and get it to people. Policymakers' jobs are to make hard decisions on who gets to do what. But as people that want to use the ocean safely, it's your responsibility to know about ocean risks when you go in the ocean. It's not the government's responsibility to make it safe for you. So our job, give you information about what we know about the universe. So with that, I will try to answer any of your questions. Thank you. Where's mom? So that's one of the biggies, right? So we know that at many of the aggregation sites, pregnant females are great. We suspect that based on the few females that have been tagged at those aggregation sites, like Guadalupe and the Farallon Islands, that they're probably doing most of their mom gestating out in the middle of the ocean. Now the question is, where's birth? So there are a lot of speculation theories about that. Because Southern California seems to be a nursery town, there's a couple other locations in Baja which may also be nurseries. The part that I couldn't get my head around is, how is it with 22 million people living along the coast? Think about how many planes fly over our beaches every day, how many boats are out in the water. If pregnant females were coming into Manhattan Beach to drop pups here, it would be news, but we don't see them. So there are a couple of possibilities. My pet theories are, females give birth in deep water. They're not marine mammals, they don't have to come to the surface. They pup in deep water, the pups swim up towards the beach. That's where it's warm. The other possibility is we do see adult white shark. It's rare to see adult white sharks along our coastal beaches in Southern California. You get north of Point Conception, the coastline gets much more rocky. That's where we see white sharks along our beaches. But in Southern California, I think our habitat is wrong. It's too sandy. We don't have good seal hollows here. However, you get out to the offshore islands, like Catalina, the Channel Islands, that's where we see most of the adult sharks. So out there, we have rocky habitat. We have a lot of rookeries now, and those rookeries have been growing like gangbusters because we know the population is going up. And there are more and more reports of adult white sharks now in offshore islands. So it's also possible that they're pupping out there, and the pups are looking for warmth and coming this way. So hopefully in the next few years, we'll figure out where that goes.
Well, that brings the question then, what are these juvenile white sharks eating in here, in Sandy Bottom?
So that's a question we hope some of our technology will help us answer. One of the new tools that we have for doing that is we have transmitters that we can feed to sharks that have little pH sensors in them. And what happens is every time they eat a meal, the pH in their stomach changes. So we can follow them around, and we can tell when they fed by smell. Now, we won't know necessarily what they're eating, but one of the other new technologies we're developing is a data logger that clamps onto the dorsal fin. So this special data logger, it's like think of it like a Huggy for the dorsal fin, clamps onto the fin. It's got an accelerometer, like a Wiimote that basically, that transmits all that information. So it'll log every time the shark wags side to side, goes up and down. In addition, it's got a video camera. So the cool thing is it gives us a shark's point of view. So we can attach this to the shark. It has a transmitter, so our robots can follow it around. We're getting really fine-scale information on how it's swimming, if it's accelerating, is it going to the bottom, what is the shark seeing, and then after a couple days, this thing pops off, floats to the surface, we can collect it again. All the technology we need to answer that question without killing sharks is available. Now, with that said, we have dissected some dead sharks. The main things that we've found in the stomach so far are stingrays. That is the #1 thing in their stomachs. So bat rays, we found remnants of ground stingrays, we found some remnants of some flatfishes, some of which we couldn't really identify, one looked like a halibut. Some evidence of maybe a moray eel. It seems like they're feeding primarily on things in the bottom. Now the question is, why come to the beach? So one of the things that we know about our coastal beaches, because I do a lot of coastal fish work, is that our beaches are incredibly productive. We have lots of stingrays, we have lots of coastal species. Particularly in the summer, those numbers go up. It's possible that these little sharks are coming here because there's abundant, easy to capture bottom prey. In addition, we know that they're not out there just eating all the time. We see them kind of milling around. And the other possibility is that they're there because it's warmer. So using our robot, going up and down the beach, we've done temperature surveys, and when you move from one stretch of beach to the other, you can get a 3-degree temperature difference. I mean, it's stark. So one of our questions is, are these little sharks kind of looking for warmth? The advantage of going to warm conditions is they can digest their meal faster, they can grow faster. So these are things that we hope, using our new tools, we'll be able to answer.
What are some of the larger sharks that have been tagged or caught in Santa Monica Bay?
Where?
How big?
Oh, the bigger ones? So probably in the neighborhood of 8 or 9 feet are probably the bigger ones. Up in Santa Barbara, they've seen some larger sharks on the shore. They haven't necessarily been caught, at least not to my knowledge.
2 questions. One, has there been any, is it a hot spot down in Seal Beach, Ray Bay area where we know there's a lot of rays? Is that the Huntington hot spot that you're showing on the map?
No.
Okay.
And the Seal Beach lifeguards would be glad to hear that. No, it's interesting because there are, you're right, trust me, we study that stingray population, and in the fall, on any given day, there can be 16,000 round stingrays in that beach. I think in some of those areas, little white sharks may pass through, they may feed, but they're probably not staying there. Huntington Flats is unbelievably productive. There's a lot of food out there for them as well, not just stingrays, but a lot of flatfishes as well. So we're not sure what makes that area productive, but we do know that the halibut gillnetters and longliners historically have fished Huntington Flats because it's a good halibut.
Well, that leads to my second question, then. If it isn't necessarily the rays that these sharks are coming in, we all know that El Porto, between pretty much, I'd say the pier and the jetty, the big jetty at El Segundo, in the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of sharks that we've never seen before. We know they're there. Could it be electrical? Could it be the power plants, the industry causing a magnetic or electrical field drawing them in? Something has moved them down into our part of the bay.
It's very possible. These are things that there's going to be a lot of research on because there's move towards more ocean energy with running power cables. That's a concern. The question that I would ask is, what's being done differently in the last 3 years that wasn't done 5 years ago?
There's a new plant, I think, they put up.
Yeah, so I mean, these are things...
Suppers.
Well, okay, so yes.
It's the same thing as the stingrays. Trust me, there's lots more stingrays out there.
But it does raise a good point. One of the other things that we are cognizant of, the fact is there's more people out there with a different vantage point now than there was 10 years ago. Being able to stand up on a board gives you a completely different vantage point, and chances are you can see them better. But with that said, there has been a lot of aerial overflights that we rely on a lot of times, and they too, when we talk to a lot of the pilots who've been flying historically through this area, they have said they have seen an increase in the number of sharks they see inshore over the last 10 years.
You mentioned the white shark cafe, the area where the tagged sharks off the Farallon Islands, they go out to the middle of the ocean. You said you don't know what they're doing out there. You think maybe they go out there for you?
So that's the question.
Yeah.
So some people call it the cafe, other people may call it... So the question is the white shark cafe. And what are the white sharks doing out there? Are they going out there to feed? And so are they feeding or are they breeding out there? So that's the debate. In my personal opinion, if I were a white shark and I was looking to find food, the middle of the Pacific, I don't think would be a target-rich environment. So our aggregation site, like the Farallons, that seems like a great place to be shark chicks. But not in the middle of the Pacific. So I guess the problem that I have with that is possible that maybe it's going on out there, and if it is, that's truly impressive. Because we're talking about 2,500 square miles of ocean that sharks have been detected. I mean, it's vast.
Yeah, because recently also, like another population on South Africa, they found out when they go to Australia, it's really down in South Africa. They're like the first
Exactly. So these are questions that we still don't have answers to, and hopefully technology is going to help us answer it, but it's not going to be tomorrow.
Is it true that it's tiger sharks and bull sharks that are more known for attacking actual humans versus a great white?
Okay,
Or
so
is that a myth?
well, the top three are white sharks, tiger sharks, and bull sharks. And mainly because of their size, and also their propensity to come in closer to shore. So historically, white sharks were kind of at the top. What we've seen is tiger sharks catching up. I don't think that's a good thing. Or the reasons for that are mainly because we're putting more and more people in the water than ever before. So encounter rates are going up for that reason. In addition, as shark populations recover in many places, particularly throughout the U.S. because of better fisheries management, these are going to be issues that we're going to have to contend with. In other countries, where shark fishing is far more prevalent, they still have shark attacks in those places. And my main argument for that is in places like Western Australia, where they're proposing shark culls, look at some of these remote places where they fish the daylights out of shark populations, but surfers and divers still get bit by sharks. It's rare everywhere. But the point is, culling sharks is not a solution. So the answer to your question is yes, white sharks are up there. And why sharks bite people? I don't care what anybody tells you. The answer is we don't know. And unless you're a psychic to the sharks, there's two possible reasons. One is predation, and the other is defense. Sharks bite people because they consider us food. Then Manhattan Beach would be a Costco for sharks. So, but we just don't see that, right? We don't see that. And in most cases, people are bitten, but they're rarely consumed. It's really rare for flesh to be taken. And I've talked to surfers, I interviewed surfers in Hawaii, who are 300 yards offshore. They get bit in the back of the leg by a tiger shark. They're panicked, they're paddling ashore, they're bleeding like crazy, and they tell me, I was so scared I outpaddled the shark. And I said, I don't think so. And the bottom line is, if a shark was intent on feeding those people, they would never make it to the beach. So the bottom line is, the other possibility is mistaken identity. They think we're something that they recognize as food. They take a bite and they realize it's not what I want. So like a buffet table with those non-fat brownies, we don't know. The other possibility, and this is one that most people neglect, is defense. Even big sharks have their own personal space. Nobody likes things getting in their personal space. And surfers are on their boards, they're looking in the water. The shark could be signaling, saying, hey, back off, you're in my space. The person doesn't. The shark comes out, takes a bite, and says, I can't warrant you, and then takes off. So the problem is, we don't know what's going through the shark's head before these things occur. So the problem that I always have when the public says, what can I do to not be attacked by a shark? We have to figure out why sharks do this before we can potentially answer those questions. Sorry about that. I wish I could answer those. I can't.
My experience was, what I got out of the shark attack is I believe in my own personal opinion that when the shark was spoke, it felt very threatened when I came near it, and it was probably defending itself versus trying to bite into me because I looked like I was a villain. And an interesting thing that I was told, what I discovered a few days ago, is that the paddlers that came in to come to my aid, one of them said that they saw the shark circling around us. So there were 6 of us coming into shore. The shark circled around, and maybe it was attracted by the blood. I'm not sure. But it was interesting that I think it was defending its position rather than going after attacking me just because I was out there.
How are you?
You know, it's coming along. I really did kind of get off easy, relatively speaking. Obviously, it could have been a lot worse. And, you know, I'm very blessed that it turned the way it did. You know, I'm still unable to work. I'm still pretty frazzled up here. And I'm still very sore. I've got really hard to punch right here, and this is still bounce back relatively fast.
What about those like wetsuits or the bottom of a surfboard that looks like a tiger, like those designs that they sell for like $500? What's the deal?
So the Shark Lab has done shark repellent research going back to the early 70s. I have a whole other talk about that. Having worked on some of that shark repellent work, my personal opinion about any shark repellent is save your money. In some circumstances, some things may work. Under all circumstances, it's not reliable, mainly because we don't understand the motivation of the shark prior to an incident. And in some cases, in a case where an animal is threatened, it will thrash out at anything. You could have a strong electric field right there. He could have been wrapped in an electric discharge, and that shark still would have bitten him. Because at that point, the animal is thinking life or death at that point, right? So the bottom line is I would not invest in a shark. And the other thing is some of them are actually fundamentally flawed. So for example, the wetsuit that has the stripes on it, so that idea was first developed in Australia because sea snakes, one of the most venomous animals on the planet, have this warning coverage. And some of us had to point out to those researchers, you know what the #1 thing in the stomachs of tiger sharks in Australia is? They look like spaghetti. So can you imagine swimming around in a striped wetsuit and a tiger shark comes up and goes,
either on a pier or off a boat, but consistently in the same spot. Legal or illegally, forget that. Like just if they're doing it in the same spot. Will that draw the shark and then other sharks to that same area consistently?
So that is a phenomenon that is quite common. We know that sharks have the ability to learn very quickly, especially when it comes to rewards. So for example, this becomes an issue in shark diving operations, right? So they use baiting to bring the sharks in. Quite often what happens in those situations is after a little period of time of using bait, they don't have to use bait anymore. Because what happens is the sharks associate the boat engines with the chum. So after that, it's just the sound, and they can tell the difference between boats. So you could have 3 boats go together. And because each boat engine has a different sound to it, the sharks will only go to the boat that was the one that was baiting a feed. So what happens over a period of time is, so then they have to go back to feeding. Now, the thing is, a lot of this is anecdotal. There's not a lot of good scientific data to back that up. A lot of fishermen obviously experience this because when they go out and set traps and things like that, they take their old bait out, they throw the bait in the water, and quite often the sharks show up. Well, the same deal. A lot of fishermen I talk to will say, sharks recognize my boat before I even pull my traps. They hear the engines and they show up, they're there, kind of following the boat. They learn fast, but they also learn fast if they're no longer getting on board. So.
Clarifying question, you say they learn fast. I thought that sharks were solitary, so it would just be one shark coming in at a time, and then would learn the lesson and would go away. So you would still rely on all of those sharks learning those lessons at different points in time?
Yes, yeah. I mean, for the most part, they're solitary. They do play off each other. They do learn from each other. There's some social facilitation in terms of learning things. How much that occurs in different species, we don't know. White sharks in particular tend to be pretty solitary.
I just want to say one thing. Don't demonize the shark. My hat's off to you, Steve, for coming through that. But if a guy hadn't hooked him and dragged him through there with his mouth chomping, there's no way that would ever happen. A juvenile great white shark will never go up and hit somebody just out of the blue. And my second question, that was a statement. My first question is, how big does a great white have to be before it starts feeding on pinnipeds or seals? For those who don't know what it is.
White sharks usually, so they go through, in fact, we have some jaws over here that you can all see. When baby white sharks have teeth that are very similar to maple sharks. They're very pointy. They still have serrated edges. As they grow, of course, they're always losing their teeth, right? They're producing new teeth because their jaws are cartilage. Anything they bite into that's hard, their teeth fall out. But what happens is about the time they reach about 3 meters, about the time they reach 9 or 10 feet, we see the teeth start to broaden. They start getting broader and broader. And they start getting more triangular. It's about that size that we see them starting to attempt to feed on marine mammals. Now that dentition, that tooth change, it matches what we see in terms of the things they eat. So when they're small, those dagger-like teeth are better for fish that have soft skin. But as the teeth get broader, those teeth are better designed for cutting through tough hides. So we think that there's this, what we call an ontogenetic shift. It's this maturity level shift in what they feed on. And that tends to happen around that 10-foot range.
Does that correlate with when they go out to sleep and when they start to bang?
So we've learned a lot about the babies. We've learned a lot about the adults. We know nothing about the tweeners. Virtually nothing about those. So, could be.
Have you done any correlation studies between dolphin population, orcas that are here occasionally, and how that affects the great white?
No, I mean that's a really good question, but my guess is the reason why those populations have been going up is because conditions are getting better. What we haven't necessarily seen is a trend. The problem with some of the big whales, when they die, they tend to float for a bit, and quite often they do attract adult white sharks or sub-adult white sharks will feed on those carcasses. The smaller cetaceans, like dolphins, don't float as much. So, I mean, it could be that sharks are feeding on them.
I'm thinking more, stories about dolphin protecting human from sharks, or the orcas coming and maybe the great whites leave.
Well, I mean, we know that it's occurred in some places. In Southern California, we don't get orcas here as much, but I haven't heard of any. I mean, if anybody hears about that, please tell me.
So do we know what kind of bait was hooked this particular shark, and is there any way to suggest that certain types of bait attract great whites or sharks in general, and they shouldn't be used in coastal waters?
So I don't know anything about it. I heard very little about the fishing operation and what the bait was used or anything like that. In terms of what a baby white shark would eat, primarily fish. So my guess is they're kind of picky. One of the things we assume about these little white sharks is they're naive. Moms give birth to them, they're on the run. They have to figure out how to eat on the run, and the clock is ticking. So their little metabolic rates are burning up calories from their livers where their storage is. And they've got literally probably a couple months to learn how to feed. If they don't do that, they're going to starve. So my guess is they start with things that are easy, that live on the bottom. Now, quite often people fishing on piers are catching the same things. And I'm sure some of the fishermen have had fish stolen by some of the white sharks on occasion, and they didn't even know it. But whether certain things are more attractive, we just
Yeah, as far as I study killer whales in California, and as far as the predators of the sharks go, between 1982 and 1997, we had a small population of killer whales named the LA pod that stayed mostly in Southern California, but went from the Farallones down to St. Cortez, and they really seemed to focus on sharks. They moved out in 1997. Since 1992, we've been seeing a population of some killer whales from British Columbia, sometimes shipped into California, as many as 300 of them. And they also specialize in sharks, and they've been known to kill them off the Farallones.
So what sharks?
Offshore type killer whales.
No.
They mostly the sleeper sharks, for the most part sleepers.
Yeah, they're really deep.
But they've been also involved in shark attacks off the Farallones too.
I've seen that before. I've heard about off the Farallon Islands, this pod of orcas, a whale watching boat saw them, they killed the shark. And then you might be able to answer this too. They said that when the shark died, it released a chemical, and all the sharks left out of the Farallon. They don't know what were.
Yeah, that was from the LA pod. That was CA to a female. It was in October of '97, and you might know something about that too.
Yeah.
But I know a lot about it.
The problem is there aren't a lot of those things that have been witnessed, and because the sample is so small, we really don't know. I mean, if that's one-off, how frequently that happens, we just don't know.
they said like maybe the other sharks detected that something was wrong, like that shark died and something bad happened to it, so they said, oh, I gotta get out of here, you know, what's left. Because maybe like they released a chemical in the water.
There's only been a couple of instances that we know of. One was a few years, 2009 and 2000. Again, not 3 times, so it's not really enough. For sure.
Dr. I have a question about the temperature. You mentioned that the young sharks are looking for warmer waters. They're down tracking the temperature of our coastal waters. Over the years, have you seen our coastal waters increase in temperature, getting warmer sooner in the season? And as we are seeing climate change and those kind of issues happening with global waters, should we expect to see more sharks here as our ocean waters get warmer?
That's a great question. So the question is, are we seeing temperature changes that are anomalous? Last winter wasn't a winter. Basically, our water temperatures never dropped. The one shark that we had tagged in Santa Monica Bay last year, as best we could tell, never left. So in previous years, many of our sharks left went to Baja, particularly because the water temperatures dropped at a certain time of year. Last year, it never really did. So whether that's a one-off, and again, that's only one shark that we have evidence for, we don't know. In addition, what we've been hearing maybe for the last 2 years is that people have been seeing more juvenile white sharks throughout the winter around the piers. And that means not all of them are migrating south. And why that is, it could be water temperature related, or there could be just some differences in migration drive.
So, juvenile is what you call juvenile,
Yeah.
Okay. So when people say, oh, you don't have to worry, juveniles, they don't want to be something the same size as you. Well, I'm not talking to you. I'm not even close to 12. So, I mean, I can be able to right? So it's not necessarily the same. I'm swimming and so on. But then the question is, when do they then go from juvenile to adulthood? And then it's time to leave and they're hungry and they're in the winter. Like, when is that day that they become adult?
That's a good question, yes. So that varies between males and females. So males mature at 7 years old. Females mature at 12 years old. There's a difference in size, so females actually have to get bigger before they mature. But we don't, and again, remember, we know nothing about the tweeners. So we have no idea where they go. We have no idea about their habits, what they feed on. We suspect that if the population's been growing, the Farallones, which has been occupied by white sharks, that we've known for at least 30 years worth of data, it's probably getting a little crowded. And therefore, some of the younger subordinate sharks coming into the population that may follow other sharks there are probably being excluded. There's just no room. So one of our theories is there may be another population, subpopulation of adult white sharks that may live along the channel lines that don't go to either of those aggregation sites. We've never been able to tag any of those sharks. Now, some of those sharks are in that tweener range, right? So that's a gap. We just don't know. I can't really answer your question. The one part I can is that we typically don't see that size class along our coastal beaches. It's the best news I can give.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the use of electromagnetic field
There have been trials in a variety of different cases on a variety of different species. And there are different types of devices, some of which are magnetic, and it's assumed that the sharks can actually detect the magnetic field, although it's also possible that they're detecting an electric field that they induce as they move through the magnet. Regardless of that, there are certain fields, whether it be magnetic or electric, that seem to be irritating to sharks. The problem is, and I had a student that did a whole series of experiments testing different types of fields. And basically, if the shark was hungry enough, it would go all the way to the food source. Right? I mean, it's twitching as it's moving in, as it's trying to bite the tail. So the thing is, on a shark that may be just curious, it may encounter the field and it goes, I don't like that, and takes off. However, if an individual is really motivated, it may not matter. So from a standpoint of using this as a personal safety device, trust me, if I wanted to make a lot of money, I would come up with some crazy shark repellent that I would market and sell people for $600, a surfboard that emits magic fields. And I would sell tons of them to surfers before anybody got bit and sued me. I'm living on a house in Palace Buildings. The bottom line is your chances of being bitten by a shark are so low, it really is not worth worrying about. It is important to know about the ocean when you go in it, know about the risks, and keep in mind there are potential things that you should keep your eyes on.
This is kind of a two-part question. First, why aren't you allowed to do any research on them if you're not hunting them? And then secondly, if they go off the endangered species list, will they then become hunted again and start the population back down when that was started?
Good question. So the way the law works is when a group's petition to list white sharks as threatened and endangered, the federal government did their review, and during the period of review, any species under review is not treated as if it's threatened and endangered. The state of California has a different Endangered Species Act law. What happens is when they're reviewing a species to determine whether it should be listed or not, it is treated as if it is a threatened and endangered species, which means all the Endangered Species Act laws apply. So the Fish and Game Commission voted in June to not list white sharks based on the best available evidence. That law, that regulation will not become ratified until August. Right now, our permits fall under the Endangered Species Act, which means they're greatly constricted because the state wants to be careful to make sure that they don't get sued for not making sure they did their due diligence. After August 6th, when that regulation is ratified, the state goes back to white sharks as being a prohibited species because it's illegal to catch them, to deliberately catch them and kill them. For us scientists to do work on them, we have to have special permits. We have to show, basically, that we're going to cause no harm to the animal. In addition, because I work at a university, I'm under federal regulation to document that anything that I do with a vertebrate, any kind of fish, minimizes pain, suffering, or injury to that animal. So we go through intense scrutiny to make sure that all the things we do are safe. Personally, I think the state is just being cautious, and I can't really blame them for that because they plan on getting sued by the environmental groups anyway. But nevertheless, that is held aside. We're hoping to get back to doing work and finding a variety of techniques to work with the animals that hopefully.
But they won't be legal to fish in that time. We won't see them.
Still illegal. Still illegal. One more question.
I've seen leopard sharks, leopard sharks, or great whites off here. Are there any other sharks that not concerned, just keep our distance away from them? Because I know there are makos sometimes, like Huntington flats. What other sharks we should say? Oh, it's cool, but let's keep some distance between us.
Well, I mean, for the most part, any of these sharks, if you catch them, as we've seen, they're in a fight for their life. So if you catch them, you have to be really careful. If you're in the water, typically the rule of thumb is any shark bigger than you, it's size, right? It's like going to a bar and saying, I'm going to pick on the little guy. So there is some sizing up that occurs, and sharks that get bigger than people tend to be less afraid. Sharks smaller than people tend to be more skittish and more worried. So the rule of thumb is there aren't very many species in California waters that typically get bigger than people that are carnivorous. So, most of them are white shark, mako shark, which are typically offshore in more blue water. Seven-gilled sharks will come in close to shore, and they can get, maybe up to 10 feet or so. But there aren't very many species. Now, with that said, I'm going to tell you we're brewing an El Nino right now, right? We have really warm water, and we've already heard of a hammerhead shark being seen off Newport. So it's typically during these conditions that we'll get tropical offshoots that will migrate up. So for example, we have had in some El Ninos tiger sharks for local fish. It's rare, but it does happen. So during these particular years, when the surface waters are really warm, it's not uncommon to occasionally get a hammerhead. Those are most common. And less common would be tiger sharks or bull sharks. I think that's...
First of all, again, let's give Crystal a big hand here.
you guys for coming into our first lecture series of the Roundhouse Aquarium here. And third of all, I want to thank the sharks, because sharks wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be having this whole thing, we wouldn't be having this lecture series. So I think tomorrow we should all end up, grab our surfboards and go swim in the ocean tomorrow.